Breaking tonight, there's a government office operating in 5 Canadian cities that most citizens don't know exists. They can't arrest you, they can't carry weapons, but their presence on Canadian soil just became the sovereignty test that will define Mark Carney's approach to American power. Right now, across North America, something's shifting. U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement operates field offices in Toronto, Vancouver, Calgary, Montreal, and Ottawa. You'd think that would spark immediate demands to shut them down. It hasn't. For years, these operations continued quietly under what everyone called a cooperative framework. But Trump's back in power, and that comfortable arrangement just stopped looking comfortable. Everyone believed ICE's Canadian presence was simply about cross-border law enforcement cooperation. Policy experts assumed these offices posed no sovereignty concerns because agents lack operational authority. Analysts thought the distinction between investigation support and enforcement activity settled any legitimacy questions. They were all utterly incorrect, because here's what nobody explained to the Canadian public. The issue was never whether ICE agents can make arrests north of the border. The question that matters now, as federal officers fatally shoot civilians in Minneapolis and detention numbers hit record highs, is whether an agency conducting what human rights experts call systematic abuses should be allowed to operate on Canadian territory at all. Let me walk you through exactly what's happening, because the details reveal why this quiet arrangement just became a very loud sovereignty test. U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement confirmed to CBC News that its Homeland Security Investigations component operates at the American Embassy in Ottawa and at consulates in Toronto, Vancouver, Calgary, and Montreal. These aren't the deportation enforcement teams making headlines in American cities. HSI focuses on what ICE calls criminal investigations to protect the United States from dangerous transnational organizations. The official mandate sounds reasonable: drug trafficking, child exploitation, weapons smuggling, human smuggling, financial fraud. HSI has over 93 offices in more than 50 countries, designed to identify and stop crime before it reaches American soil. Here's the framework that's existed for years. HSI special agents in Canada do not conduct operational activities. They cannot make arrests. They cannot execute search warrants. They do not carry firearms. Their role is investigative support, working with Canadian law enforcement on cases involving cross-border criminal activity. What do these agents actually do? Investigative support. They work with Canadian law enforcement on cross-border cases. Washington points to October as proof this arrangement works. Police laid 700 charges against 20 people after raids in Ottawa, Cornwall, and Akwesasne turned up 14 kilograms of drugs and 35 firearms. These partnerships keep both countries safer, the U.S. Embassy insists. For years, this arrangement existed in a comfortable gray zone. Cooperation without controversy. Investigation without intrusion. Then Trump returned to power. And suddenly, everything about ICE's presence in Canada started looking very different. January 7th. Renee Nicole Good was fatally shot by an ICE agent in Minnesota. Then, 17 days later, ICU nurse Alex Preddy was killed by Border Patrol agents. CBS News reported that ICE was holding a record 73,000 people in detention by mid-January, an 84% increase since Donald Trump took office. Translation: the agency with offices on Canadian soil is now operating at unprecedented scale with increasingly lethal consequences. And that's when Edmonton Strathcona MP Heather McPherson, currently running for federal NDP leadership, sent a letter that forced this issue into the open. Her demand to Mark Carney was direct and unambiguous: close ICE field offices in Canada until the human rights crisis is resolved. Canada has sovereign authority over who operates on our territory, McPherson wrote, and you must revoke ICE's permission to maintain offices here. Notice the framing. She didn't question whether HSI agents follow Canadian law. She questioned whether Canada should grant office space to an agency whose operations south of the border now include systematic human rights violations. The U.S. Embassy responded quickly, posting on social media that HSI's work in Canada is about partnership, public safety, and upholding the law. The message emphasized successful investigations and cooperative relationships with Canadian counterparts. But here's what that response couldn't address: legitimacy isn't about legal authority. It's about moral standing. And an agency detaining record numbers of people while federal officers kill civilians doesn't get to claim moral standing just because it follows procedural rules in Canada. Kersten saw what others missed. The assistant professor of human rights law at the University of the Fraser Valley put it plainly in that context. I think people rightly deserve and want to know more about what experts have called a paramilitary of the Trump administration is doing in Canada. Read that again. A paramilitary of the Trump administration, operating in 5 Canadian cities. Kersten continued, and whether in fact we should have any presence, regardless of what they're doing, of an entity that is committing such horrible harms with impunity in America, again, at a time when our sovereignty is consistently being put to question by American authorities. There it is. That's the sovereignty test. Nobody's saying Canada and the United States shouldn't cooperate on human trafficking or drug smuggling. Kersten made that point explicitly. Cross-border cooperation on transnational crime. Essential. The question is different. Does ICE specifically need to be the agency doing that work on Canadian soil? His point cuts deeper than most are willing to acknowledge other agencies under the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, like Customs and Border Protection, could potentially carry out HSI's current duties without ICE needing to maintain Canadian offices. Translation: Canada could maintain security cooperation while refusing to host an agency whose domestic operations now violate human rights standards. And right there, dear viewers, is where Carney's approach to American power gets tested in the most practical way possible. Think about the position Canada finds itself in right now. An American agency with documented human rights violations maintains offices in 5 major cities. Those offices don't grant arrest authority or weapon permits, but they do grant something potentially more significant legitimacy through presence. Every IC sign on a Toronto or Vancouver building sends a message, not to criminals, to Canadians. The message says this agency's methods are acceptable enough that Canada grants them office space and cooperative relationships. That message held one meaning when ICE operated as a conventional law enforcement agency. It holds an entirely different meaning when ICE operates as what experts call Trump's paramilitary, detaining record numbers while federal officers kill civilians with increasing frequency. The comfortable position for any Canadian government would be maintaining the status quo. The offices exist, cooperation continues, and nobody has to make a definitive statement about American methods. Ottawa could point to the technical distinctions, the limited scope, the successful joint investigations. But comfortable positions don't survive sovereignty tests. And Trump's approach to Canada has made this a sovereignty test, whether anyone wanted it or not. When the American president threatens annexation, imposes tariffs as leverage, and demands Canadian capitulation as the price of partnership, the presence of American law enforcement offices on Canadian soil stops being a technical question. It becomes a symbolic statement about whose authority Canadians recognize on their own territory. McPherson understood this perfectly. Her letter didn't argue legal technicalities. It asserted sovereign authority. Canada has sovereign authority over who operates on our territory, and you must revoke ICE's permission. She's right. Canada does have that authority. The question is whether Carney will use it. Here's what makes this moment so revealing. The choice facing Canada isn't complicated. It's uncomfortable, but it's not complicated. Option 1, maintain ICE's Canadian presence, citing successful cooperation and limited scope, except that Canadian territory hosts offices of an agency conducting systematic human rights violations, and hope the technical distinctions provide sufficient cover. Option 2 announced that while Canada values security cooperation with the United States, the current operations and methods of ICE are incompatible with Canadian values. Offer to transfer HSI's current investigative support role to other U.S. agencies that aren't implicated in human rights abuses. Maintain security cooperation while refusing to legitimize Trump's immigration enforcement apparatus. The first option is easier in the short term. It avoids confrontation, maintains bureaucratic relationships, and lets Ottawa claim nothing has changed because the technical framework remains the same. The second option is sovereignty in practice. It states clearly that cooperation has limits, that Canadian territory isn't available for agencies that violate human rights, and that partnership doesn't mean capitulation to American methods. And this is where Carney's entire approach to Trump gets tested on something concrete and specific. Not tariffs, not trade negotiations, not abstract questions about bilateral relationships. 5 office locations, 1 agency, a clear choice about whose standards govern Canadian territory. If you've been following this channel, you know why this matters beyond the immediate question. This is about whether Canada's transition from reliance to resilience includes the willingness to make uncomfortable decisions about American power. Because sovereignty isn't just economic policy or trade diversification. Sovereignty is the practical assertion that Canadian territory operates under Canadian values and that cooperation with allies doesn't require hosting their human rights violations. ICE maintains that it has a long-standing and productive relationship with Canada, one of America's most essential partners. That's exactly the framing that treats partnership as obligation rather than choice. Canada is an essential partner. That's precisely why Canada can set conditions on which American agencies operate on Canadian soil. Essential partners have leverage. The question is whether Ottawa will use it. Standing at the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa, American officials stress partnership and public safety. They list successful investigations and cooperative relationships. They emphasize that HSI agents follow Canadian law, and all of that would matter more if the broader context hadn't changed so dramatically. But when ICE holds 73,000 people in detention, when federal officers kill civilians, when Trump treats Canadian sovereignty as negotiable, the presence of ICE offices in Canada stops being about investigative cooperation and starts being about legitimacy and perception. This wasn't the sovereignty test anyone scheduled. It emerged from circumstances, from policy choices, from the collision between cooperative frameworks established in different times and the harsh realities of Trump's second term. But it's the test that's happening now. And the answer Carney provides will reveal whether Canada's new approach to American power includes the willingness to say no to arrangements that compromise Canadian values, even when saying yes would be procedurally easier. 5 cities. 1 agency. A sovereignty test nobody saw coming. The world's watching now. They want to see whether Canada treats its own territory as negotiable or sovereign. What happens next tells us everything about whether Canadian independence is rhetoric or reality.